The school hallway buzzed with the usual chatter and laughter of students getting ready for another day of lessons. But for 12-year-old Jaden Williams, this morning already felt heavier than usual. Clutching his worn-out backpack, he walked into his first period classroom with his head held high, despite the stares and whispers he had grown used to hearing. Jaden was one of the brightest students in his grade. He loved math, dreamed of becoming an engineer, and had a knack for solving problems that left even his classmates amazed. But none of that seemed to matter to Mrs. Carmichael, his strict, sharp-tongued teacher. She was the kind of person who always had a comment ready, a cutting remark she didn't seem to mind delivering, especially to kids like Jaden. As he took his seat in the middle row, Jaden felt the usual weight of Mrs. Carmichael's gaze on him. "Mr. Williams," she called out, her voice carrying an icy edge, "do you think you'll manage to pay attention today, or is your mind too busy wandering off into daydreams again?" A ripple of muffled giggles swept through the classroom. Jaden sat still, his jaw tightening. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but experience had taught him not to talk back. Not here. Not now. Mrs. Carmichael continued, not giving him a chance to respond. "You know, it's not enough to just sit in this classroom, Mr. Williams. You actually have to try. I've seen far too many kids like you waste their potential." The pause she left between the words felt intentional weighted. It was like she wanted the words to linger, to cut deeper. Jaden glanced down at his notebook, gripping his pencil tightly. The humiliation wasn't new, but it didn't hurt any less. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some curious, others amused, and a few pitying. The pity was the worst. The rest of the class dragged on, with Mrs. Carmichael taking every opportunity to single Jaden out. If he didn't raise his hand to answer a question, she'd call on him with a smirk, her tone implying she didn't expect him to know the answer. If he did raise his hand, she'd find a way to criticize the way he explained himself. But what Mrs. Carmichael didn't know, what no one in this room knew, was that Jaden wasn't just any ordinary kid. His life outside this classroom was far from what anyone here could imagine. He had spent years watching people underestimate him, and he had learned to keep his head down, to keep his truth hidden. By the time lunch rolled around, Jaden felt drained. He sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, nibbling on his sandwich while trying to block out the noise around him. But even here, he couldn't escape. Mrs. Carmichael's voice still echoed in his mind. That afternoon, during science class, things took a turn. Mrs. Carmichael had been going on about the importance of discipline and respect, a topic she seemed to enjoy weaving into every lecture. At one point, she looked directly at Jaden, her lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some people," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "think they can get through life by cutting corners or relying on others. But let me tell you, that won't work in the real world. Hard work and respect for authority are what matter. Isn't that right, Mr. Williams?" Jaden could feel his cheeks burning. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but before he could, Mrs. Carmichael added, "You should be grateful to have someone like me holding you accountable. Not everyone gets that chance." The room went silent. For a moment, it felt like everyone was waiting to see what Jaden would do. He looked up at her, his dark eyes steady and unwavering. With a calmness that took even him by surprise, he finally spoke. "You're right, Mrs. Carmichael. Not everyone gets the chance to be held accountable." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "And not everyone gets the chance to learn from someone who works for their family." The room erupted in a mix of gasps and whispers. Mrs. Carmichael's confident smile faltered, her face paling as she blinked rapidly, trying to process what Jaden had just said. What did you say?" she stammered, her voice losing its usual sharpness. Jaden leaned back in his chair, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "I said my dad is your boss." The silence that followed was deafening. The room was frozen, and the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead projector. Mrs. Carmichael stared at Jaden as if she hadn't heard him correctly, her face shifting between confusion and disbelief. The confidence in her posture seemed to waver, her hands gripping the edges of her desk tighter than before. Jaden didn't flinch under her gaze. He wasn't one to seek attention, but this moment felt different. He wasn't trying to embarrass her, he just couldn't hold back anymore. Years of biting his tongue, of enduring subtle remarks and assumptions, had built up like a dam ready to burst. Mrs. Carmichael cleared her throat, clearly scrambling to regain her composure. "That's quite a statement, young man," she said, forcing a strained smile. "Perhaps you'd like to elaborate." Jaden leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his desk. "I think it's pretty simple," he said evenly. "My dad owns the company that oversees this school. I didn't think it mattered, but since you keep talking about accountability, I figured it was worth mentioning." The whispers among the students grew louder. Some were wide-eyed, others exchanged incredulous glances. Mrs. Carmichael looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the rest of the class, she avoided looking at Jaden entirely. Her usual sharpness was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that was palpable. Even the other students noticed the shift, but no one dared to say anything outright. When the bell finally rang, Jaden packed up his things slowly, letting the others leave before him. He wasn't in a rush to deal with the flood of questions he knew was waiting for him in the hallway. As he walked out, he felt a hand grab his shoulder. He turned to see Michael, one of his classmates, who usually sat 2 rows behind him. Michael's eyes were wide with curiosity. "Dude," Michael said, keeping his voice low, "was that for real? Like your dad's actually in charge of all this?" Jaden gave a small nod. "Yeah. He doesn't really talk about it much, though. He likes to keep things low-key." Michael let out a low whistle. "Man, I bet Mrs. Carmichael's freaking out right now. I've never seen her lose her cool like that. You think she's scared or something?" Jaden shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. I wasn't trying to scare her." He hesitated before adding, "I just wanted her to stop treating me like I don't belong here." Michael nodded slowly, as if the words had struck a chord. "Well, she definitely won't mess with you now," he said with a grin. "I'll catch you later, though. Everyone's going to be talking about this for weeks." As Michael walked away, Jaden sighed and adjusted his backpack. The truth was, he didn't feel as victorious as Michael seemed to think he should. He hadn't planned to reveal his dad's position, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to stand up for himself. That night at home, Jaden sat at the dinner table with his parents, trying to gauge the right time to bring up what had happened. His dad, Marcus Williams, was a man of quiet strength, always calm and composed, even in the face of challenges. Jaden admired him more than anyone else in the world. As they finished eating, Marcus glanced at Jaden. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, son. Everything okay at school?" Jaden hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's fine. Just kind of a weird day." His mom, Diane, looked up from her plate, her brow furrowing slightly. "Weird how?" she asked gently. Jaden took a deep breath and explained what had happened. He told them about Mrs. Carmichael's remarks, how she always seemed to single him out, and how he had finally snapped and mentioned his dad's role. Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Jaden finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I see," he said, after a long pause. "And how do you feel about it now?" "I don't know," Jaden admitted. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble, but I couldn't take it anymore. It's like she doesn't think I'm good enough to be in her class." Diane reached over and placed a comforting hand on Jaden's. "You are more than good enough," she said firmly. "Don't ever doubt that." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I understand why you said what you did, Jaden. But sometimes standing up for yourself means handling things differently. People like Mrs. Carmichael, they may not always change their attitudes, no matter what you say." Jaden frowned. "So, what am I supposed to do? Just let her keep treating me like that?" "Not at all," Marcus said. "But there's a difference between defending yourself and letting someone else's behavior dictate how you act. You're smart, Jaden. You don't need to prove that to her or anyone else. Just keep being yourself, and eventually people will see the truth. Jayden nodded slowly, taking in his dad's words. But deep down, he wasn't sure it would be that simple. The next day at school, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Mrs. Carmichael seemed on edge, her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic restraint. She avoided calling on Jayden during class and barely made eye contact with him. During lunch, a group of students gathered around Jayden, peppering him with questions about his dad and the mysterious company he supposedly ran. Jayden tried to deflect, but the curiosity was relentless. One student, a girl named Sophia, leaned in closer and whispered, "Do you think Mrs. Carmichael is going to get in trouble? Like, will your dad fire her or something?" Jayden shook his head. "It's not like that. My dad doesn't even know her, and I don't want her to lose her job. I just want her to treat me like everyone else." Sophia looked skeptical. "Still, she has to be freaking out. I mean, she's always so strict, but yesterday, she looked like she'd seen a ghost." Jayden couldn't argue with that. Mrs. Carmichael's reaction had been unlike anything he had ever seen. But what bothered him more was the lingering question of why she acted the way she did. Did she have some kind of grudge against him? Or was it something deeper? As the day went on, Jayden found himself thinking more and more about his teacher. Something about her behavior didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just her harsh words or the way she singled him out. It was the way she had reacted when he mentioned his dad. It was almost as if she knew something he didn't. That night, Jayden lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His dad's advice echoed in his mind, but so did the look on Mrs. Carmichael's face when he had spoken those words. There was more to this story, Jayden was sure of it, and he was determined to find out what it was.